he took the key from the nail by the door at 8 o'clock in the evening, same as every evening for the past 11 years, and stepped out into an air so thick with heat and moisture that breathing it felt less like breathing and more like drinking something that had been left too long in the sun. The streets of the riverfront district were quiet, in a way. They had not been quiet in the 3 years Elias Doud had lived in this part of the city. Not the quiet of a Sunday morning, which was a natural quiet, a quiet that held the promise of noise returning. This was something different. This was the quiet of a place that had been warned. Elias stood on the front step of his rooming house on Tichupatula Street and looked both ways down the block. A dog crossed the far intersection, moving slowly, its head down. Nothing else moved. The gas lights had been lit, but no one walked beneath them, down toward the river, half a block away. He could see the dark bulk of the Crescent Cotton Warehouse rising against the lesser darkness of the sky. And beyond it, just barely, the gray suggestion of the Mississippi rolling south toward the Gulf. He touched the left side of his head out of habit. The way a man touches a scar to confirm it is still there, and found only the smooth, hard knot of cartilage where his ear had been. 23 years since a man named Colquitt had taken it with a knife in a Natchez barroom, and he still reached for it, sometimes in the mornings, half asleep. He supposed he always would. He put on his hat and walked toward the warehouse. The city had been dying since July. That was not how the newspapers put it, of course. The newspapers used words like outbreak and precautionary, and the authorities are confident. But Elias had lived through the epidemic of 1878, when 4,000 people had died in New Orleans in a single season, and he knew what yellow fever looked like when it moved through a city. It looked like this: empty streets, shuttered windows, the slow disappearance of sound. The first cases had appeared in the Irish Channel in the second week of July. By the end of the month, the fever had spread through the riverside neighborhoods and up into the Garden District. The City Board of Health had quarantined the affected blocks, then expanded the quarantine, then expanded it again, until the quarantine itself seemed to become meaningless, a line drawn in water. People left who could leave. The ones who stayed were the ones who had no money for train tickets or passage upriver, or the ones who were already sick, or the ones, like Elias, who had decided for their own private reasons that leaving was not something they were prepared to do. He walked down the middle of the street rather than the sidewalk. Not because it was safer, it was not, but because he could see further that way, and seeing further gave him a feeling of control that he understood to be largely false, but needed anyway. The cobblestones were damp with river humidity. His boots made soft sounds against them. Somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, a single bell was ringing, and he counted the strokes without meaning to. 7, 8, 9. Then silence. Someone had painted a red X on a door 3 houses down from his rooming house. He had noticed it that morning and had thought about it on and off all day. He did not know the people behind that door. The Crescent Cotton Warehouse occupied most of a city block between Tichupatula Street and the river levee. It was a long, low brick building, 3 stories tall at its center, with loading bays running the length of its river face, and offices on the street side that were never open before 10 in the morning, and always locked by 4 in the afternoon. Elias had worked there as night watchman since the autumn of 1877, which meant he had been walking its perimeter and pacing its interior in darkness for 11 years. He knew it the way a man knows his own body, not consciously, not by deliberate study, but by the accumulation of 10,000 small encounters in the dark. He used a key to let himself through the side gate, locked it behind him, and stood for a moment in the loading yard. The bales were stacked under the covered overhang along the riverside, 3,000 bales of raw cotton, each one wrapped in rough burlap and bound with iron bands, each one weighing 500 pounds. They had been there since the middle of July, waiting for a ship that had been delayed, and then delayed again, and then delayed once more, its captain apparently unwilling to enter a quarantined port if he had any other option. Elias did not blame him. He took his lantern from the hook inside the gate, struck a match, and lit it. The yellow light swelled up around him. He adjusted the wick until the flame was steady, then began his first circuit of the yard. The cotton bales stood in their rows like enormous sleeping animals. He walked between them, trailing one hand along their rough sides, feeling the give of the packed fiber beneath the burlap. They smelled of the delta, of river mud and August heat, and the particular sweetness of raw cotton that was not entirely pleasant and not entirely unpleasant, but was simply the smell of the work, the smell that had been the backdrop of his life here on the riverfront for more than a decade. Until 3 weeks ago, there had been 2 of them. Henri Beaumont had worked the second half of the night, coming on at 2 in the morning and staying until the warehouse crew arrived at 7. He was a Creole man of 50, heavyset, with a gold tooth in the front of his mouth that caught the light when he smiled, which was often. He had a wife and 3 daughters in the Tremé neighborhood, and he talked about them constantly in the way that a man talks about the things he is afraid of losing. The older daughter was married. The middle one was studying to be a seamstress. The youngest, who was 12, was apparently possessed of a singing voice that could stop conversation in a room. When the fever reached Tremé in the first week of August, Henri had come to Elias on the loading dock and told him he was leaving. Not quitting the job, leaving the city, taking his wife and daughters to his wife's people in Baton Rouge until the fever passed. "You should come too," Henri had said. He had said it the way men say things they know will be refused, out of courtesy rather than expectation. "I have no people in Baton Rouge," Elias had said. "Then come anyway. There are boarding houses." Elias had looked out at the river, at the flat brown water moving south. "Someone has to watch the cotton," he had said. Henri had stood there for a moment longer, as if he might say something more. Then he had shaken Elias' hand, retrieved his lantern from the hook, and walked out through the gate. Elias had watched him go, and then had turned back to the warehouse, and had not thought about it again until now, standing in the loading yard in the dark, with the silence of the city pressed around him like a physical thing. He wondered if Henri's youngest daughter was still singing. The river was never silent. Even now, in August, in a city that had gone quiet with fear, the Mississippi made its own sounds regardless. The water moved against the levee with a low, continuous chuckling that was almost conversational. Somewhere downstream, a steamboat was moving in the dark. Elias could hear the faint rhythm of its paddle wheel, a sound like the slow beating of a large, tired heart. Once, an hour into his shift, something large broke the surface of the river, a log, probably, or a piece of driftwood, and the splash it made seemed enormous in the stillness, and Elias turned toward it involuntarily, his hand going to the short club he wore on his belt. Nothing. Only the dark water and the dark sky above it, and the lights of the opposite bank far away. He had come to love the river in the way that a person loves something that has been the constant background of their life. Not passionately, not romantically, but with a deep, habitual gratitude for its continued presence. Before the riverfront, before New Orleans, he had been inland in Tennessee, working first in a sawmill, and then on a road crew, and then doing the various kinds of hard labor that a man with few skills and no education falls into when he needs to eat. He had come to New Orleans in the autumn of 1874 on a flatboat with 3 other men whose names he had forgotten, meaning to stay only long enough to find a ship going somewhere else. He had never found the ship, or rather he had found it and decided not to take it, and then had found another and made the same decision, until eventually the river had simply absorbed him the way it absorbed everything, gradually and without ceremony. He was not unhappy here. He did not know if happy was a word that applied to him, but he was not unhappy. He found the first dead rat near the eastern corner of the main warehouse, tucked against the base of the wall where the brick met the ground. It was a large rat, gray, lying on its side with its feet slightly curled, the way dead things curl inward on themselves. He crouched and looked at it without touching it. The lantern light made its fur look almost silver. He was not a superstitious man. He had lived too long and worked too close to the raw material of life, blood and labor and river mud, to give much credence to omens and signs. But he knew that rats died in buildings all the time, of any number of ordinary causes, and he also knew what yellow fever did to a city's rat population, and he knew which kind of dead rat this looked like. He stood up and moved on. There were 3 more before midnight. 1 near the water pump in the northeast corner, 2 more inside the warehouse proper, in the narrow passage between the cotton bales and the north wall. He stepped over each one and did not stop to examine them. There was nothing to be done about dead rats. The only thing to be done was to keep walking, keep making the circuit, keep being present in the way that the job required him to be present. By midnight, he had made 4 complete circuits of the building. His legs ached in the low, steady way they always ached by this point in the night, his left knee particularly, which had been damaged in a fall from a wagon in 1881 and had never fully healed. He sat on a cotton bale in the loading yard and unlaced his left boot and rubbed the knee for a while, looking up at the sky. The moon was not visible. The sky was the particular dark gray of a New Orleans August night, thick with clouds and river moisture. The city's gas lamps reflecting off the overcast, so that there was a faint, diffuse glow to the south and west, but actual darkness overhead. He had not always been a watchman before the warehouse, before New Orleans, before the road cruise and the sawmill in Tennessee. He had been, briefly and badly, a schoolteacher. This fact about himself was the one he was most reluctant to share, not from shame exactly, but because it seemed so implausible given what he had become that people usually assumed he was lying. He had gone to a decent school in Virginia as a boy, the son of a man who repaired clocks, and believed in education with the fervor of someone who had come to it late and found it transforming. He had read widely, had a good memory for what he read, and had been told by his father's friend, a Mr. Hartwell who ran the county school, that he had the temperament for teaching, which apparently meant that he was patient and not easily rattled. He had taught for 2 years in a one-room school in Wythe County, Virginia. Then the war had come. He did not speak about the war, not the things he had done in it, not the things he had seen, not the years of it that had happened to him like weather. He had been 19 when he enlisted and 24 when he came back. And the 5 years between those 2 points had made him into a man who could not return to a schoolroom and stand in front of children and pretend that what he was telling them about the world was true. He had tried once, in 1866. He had stood up in front of 23 children in a school in Knoxville and looked at their faces for approximately 40 seconds before picking up his hat and walking out the door. After that, there had been many things. And then there had been the warehouse, and the night, and the river. He was 57 years old. He had never married. He had, at various points in his life, been close to marrying twice, and both times something in him had pulled back at the last possible moment. Some private refusal that he could not entirely explain, and had long since stopped trying to. Mr. Archibald Dempsey, the warehouse manager, had come by on Thursday with 2 of his clerks, all 3 of them wearing handkerchiefs soaked in camphor pressed against their faces, which Elias thought was probably useless, but did not say so. Dempsey was a thin man of 40, with a careful manner and clean hands, and the perpetually worried expression of someone who had been given responsibility for things that kept threatening to go wrong. He had stood in the loading yard and talked at Elias through his camphor handkerchief, and what he said was this: the company was aware of the difficult situation. The company valued Elias' service and his long record of reliability. The company was also, however, aware that the epidemic had reached a serious stage, and the company wished it to be known that any employee who felt it necessary to leave the city temporarily would not be penalized for doing so. The company's insurance policy covered the cotton against theft and fire regardless of whether a watchman was present or not. "You don't have to stay," Dempsey had said, when he'd finished with the company's position. He had said it quietly, looking at Elias directly, which Elias appreciated. "I know that," Elias had said. "The fever is moving through this district." "I know that too." Dempsey had looked at him for a long moment, then at the cotton bales, then at the river. "Is there something keeping you here?" "Family or no family," Elias had said. "I just don't have anywhere I particularly need to be." Dempsey had seemed to find this answer either deeply sad or deeply satisfying. Elias couldn't tell which. He had nodded, shaken Elias' hand, and left with his clerks. Elias had watched them walk quickly down Tichupatula Street and had noted that they turned the corner without looking back. He had thought about it afterward, alone in the loading yard with the heat pressing down and the river smell heavy in the air. He had thought about it carefully and honestly, the way he tried to think about things that mattered, which was without sentiment and without self-deception, or at least with as little of each as he could manage. The truth was that there was nowhere to go. This was the plainest part of it and the easiest to understand. He had no family. He had no close friends outside the city. He had enough money saved to buy train passage to Memphis or Baton Rouge. But once there, he would need to find work. And finding work at 57 with one ear and a bad knee was not a simple proposition. New Orleans had kept him because it was the kind of city that kept people. It collected them from the river traffic and the Gulf trade, and somehow retained them, the way sediment settles at a delta. But that was not the whole truth. The whole truth included the fact that leaving felt, to him, like a kind of defeat that he was not willing to accept. He had stayed through the fever of 1878. He had stayed through the Great Flood of 1882. He had stayed through a dock fire in 1884 that had burned 2 warehouses to the waterline. He had stayed because staying was the thing he was best at, the skill he had developed most fully across 57 years of living. And he did not see why a fever, even a bad fever, should be the thing that broke it. He understood that this was not entirely rational. He understood it might kill him. He had considered this possibility in the careful, unsentimental way he tried to consider things, and had found that it did not, when he held it up to the light, frighten him as much as he thought it should. This seemed important to notice. The interior of the warehouse was different from the loading yard in a way that Elias had never been able to fully articulate, even to himself. Outside, there was always the river, its smell, its sound, its presence at the edge of everything, and the sky above, and the street beyond the gate, all of which gave the night a kind of context, placed it within the larger world. Inside the warehouse, none of that applied. The warehouse interior was its own world, sealed and absolute. The ceiling was 20 feet above the ground floor, crossed by heavy timber beams that disappeared into shadow beyond the reach of his lantern. The cotton bales formed a kind of landscape within it. Hills and valleys of packed white fiber, passages and clearings, dead ends and throughways that Elias had learned as thoroughly as a farmer learns his fields. On hot nights, and this was a hot night, the cotton bales radiated a warmth of their own, a dense, slow heat released from the compressed fiber, so that walking among them was like walking through a place that was itself alive and breathing. He made his interior circuit at 10:30. North wall, east wall, south wall, west wall, checking the loading bay doors, testing the locks on the office partitions, listening. The listening was the most important part, not for voices or footsteps, though those too, but for the sounds of the building itself. The way the timbers settled when the temperature changed. The creaking of the iron roof supports in the river wind. The small, industrious sounds of vermin in the walls, which were constant, and therefore reassuring in their constancy. When the sounds of vermin stopped, that was when you needed to pay attention. Tonight the rats inside the walls were quiet. Her name had been Cora, and she had died in October of 1869 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, of consumption at the age of 28. She had been engaged to him for 14 months. They had planned to marry in the spring of 1869, but she had begun coughing in February, and by April they both understood, without saying it directly, that the spring wedding would need to be postponed. By August, there was no more talk of postponement. By October, she was gone. He thought about her sometimes on these long night shifts, not with grief exactly. Grief had done its work a long time ago and moved on, the way grief does, but with a kind of wondering. She had been a bright, practical woman who laughed easily and had opinions about everything, and was entirely unintimidated by him, which at 28 he had found both disconcerting and irresistible. She had called him on his tendency toward dramatic solitude, which she named as such without particular sympathy. You could just talk to people, she had said once, with the cheerful directness that was her most characteristic quality. It's not as complicated as you make it. He had been trying to do that in his way ever since. He wondered sometimes what she would have made of this, of his life as it had turned out. The river, the warehouse, the long nights, the accumulated silence. He could not decide whether she would have found it sad or simply characteristic. Probably she would have had something to say about it that would have been true and slightly uncomfortable to hear. And he would have been glad she said it. She had been 28 when she died. He was now 57. He had been older than her for 29 years. At 11 o'clock, a bell began to ring somewhere in the deeper city. Not the steady, mechanical bell of a church tower marking the hour, but the slow, deliberate, irregular toll of a death bell. He stood still in the loading yard and listened to it. In other years, on ordinary nights, it would have been impossible to hear such a thing from this distance, lost in the general sound of the city, the barrooms and the voices, and the river traffic, and the music that drifted down from the Creole neighborhoods above Canal Street. Tonight, there was nothing to compete with it. The bell rang, and the city was quiet around it, and the sound traveled far. He counted 22 strokes before the bell stopped. He did not know who had died. He did not know which bell it was, or which neighborhood, or whether the dead person was someone he had ever seen or spoken to, or simply passed on the street. That was the particular quality of death in epidemic time. It lost its individuality. People became numbers, became statistics, became the slow march of tolling bells, and red-painted doors, and the carts that moved through the streets before dawn. This was the part that he found hardest to hold on to. The idea that behind each number was a specific, irreplaceable person who had once laughed about something, who had once been cold, who had once eaten a meal and been satisfied by it. He tried to hold on to it anyway, he thought. Someone died tonight who did not expect to die tonight. He thought, there is a specific room in this city, in a specific house, where a specific person's breathing has just stopped. He thought, in that room, right now, someone is realizing what has happened. He turned back to the warehouse and continued his rounds. The man appeared at the gate at midnight. Elias heard him before he saw him. A scraping sound on the cobblestones outside the fence, and then the rattle of someone's hand on the iron bars. He came around the corner of the loading overhang with his lantern and his hand on his club, and found a man standing at the gate with both hands wrapped around the bars, leaning into them as if the bars were the only thing keeping him upright. He was a white man of perhaps 40, though illness aged people, and it was difficult to be certain. He was wearing a brown wool coat that was too heavy for August. The kind of coat a man wears when the coat is the best thing he owns regardless of the weather, and beneath it, a cotton shirt that had once been white but was now gray with sweat and road dirt. He had no hat. His hair was dark and matted flat against his head. His face in the lantern light had the specific waxy sheen that Elias associated with high fever. "Can I have water?" the man said. It was not quite a question. His voice was rough and low, the voice of someone who had not spoken in some time. Elias stood 6 feet from the gate and looked at him. The man looked back. His eyes were dark and very bright, the brightness that came not from alertness, but from the fever burning behind them. "Where are you from?" Elias asked. "Upriver," the man said. "Came in on a boat. 3 days ago." "Where are you going?" "I had a sister." He paused. "On Annunciation Street." "Had, yes." Another pause longer. "Had." Elias stood with his hand on his club and looked at the man through the gate. He was not afraid, or rather, he was afraid in the habitual background way that he had been afraid for the past 3 weeks. A fear that had become so constant he had largely stopped distinguishing it from ordinary wakefulness. What he felt now was something more specific, the particular tension of a decision that had not yet been made. The man said his name was James Latter. He was from a town called Genevieve in Missouri, and he had come downriver on a freight barge to find his sister, who had written to him in June saying she was sick. He had not received her letter until the end of July, and by the time he had arranged passage south and arrived in New Orleans, it had been. He paused here, calculating, or perhaps just remembering. It had been too late. He had gone to his sister's house on Annunciation Street and found it closed, and the neighbors unwilling to open their doors and speak to a stranger from upriver. He had found, eventually, a woman on the next block who would speak to him from her window, keeping the window mostly closed as she did so, who had told him that his sister had died on the 2nd of August, 3 weeks ago. "She has a child," the man said. Has, I don't know. A boy. about 9 or 10 years old. Where is the child? Elias asked. I don't know. That's what I was trying to find out. But then he gestured vaguely at himself, at his condition. I started feeling it 3 days ago. I've been walking mostly, trying to find. He stopped again. He seemed to have difficulty maintaining the thread of the sentence. He looked at Elias through the gate bars. I just need water, he said. I'm not asking for anything else. Elias went to the pump in the northeast corner of the yard and filled the tin cup that lived on the shelf beside it. He came back to the gate and opened it, not widely, but enough to pass the cup through, which he did, holding it out at arm's length. The man took it with both hands. He drank in long, desperate swallows, tilting his head back, his throat working. When the cup was empty, he lowered it and held it out, and Elias took it back. Careful not to let their fingers touch, he refilled it. He passed it through the gate again. The man drank more slowly this time. Thank you, Ladder said. He was sitting on the cobblestones now, his back against the fence post, the cup held in both hands against his chest. Elias stood just inside the gate. You should find the fever hospital, he said, on Canal Street. I know about the fever hospital. I know what they'll do, Ladder said. They'll put me in a cot and wait to see which way it goes. He looked up at Elias. I've seen the fever hospital from the outside. I know what kind of place it is. Elias did not argue with this because it was accurate. The fever hospital was a place people went when they had no other option, and frequently they did not come back from it. This was partly because by the time people went to the fever hospital, they were already very ill, and partly because the conditions inside it were such that a person who went there mildly ill might come out, if they came out, considerably worse. You can't stay here, Elias said. I know. They were quiet for a moment. The river moved behind the warehouse. The cup clinked faintly against Ladder's ring as he shifted his grip. The boy might still be in the city, Ladder said. If there was anyone to take him in, a neighbor, or a lot of people have left. I know. A pause. I just keep thinking about him. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes. Elias stayed inside the gate. Ladder stayed outside it, and they spoke through the bars in the low, careful way that people speak when they are both aware of how much danger there is in the air between them. Ladder talked about his sister. Her name had been Marie. She had been 34. She had married a man named Colbert, who had died of something else 3 years earlier, leaving her alone with the boy in the city. And he talked about the boy, whose name he believed was Thomas, and about the specific weight of having traveled 2 weeks downriver on a freight barge, only to arrive at a closed door. Elias listened. He was not a naturally talkative man, and he had learned over the years that the most useful thing he could do in most conversations was to keep his own words to a minimum and let the other person find their way to what they needed to say. Ladder needed to say this, that he had come a long way and lost a person he had hoped to save, and was now sitting on cobblestones outside a locked warehouse with a fever burning through him in the dark. He needed someone to hear this said. Elias could do that much. When Ladder stood up to leave carefully, with both hands on the fence post, gathering himself with visible effort, He thanked Elias again for the water. "Is there somewhere you can go?" Elias asked. "I'll find somewhere," Ladder said. He sounded like a man who was not sure he believed this. He walked away down Tchupatula Street, moving slowly, keeping to the middle of the road. Elias watched him until the darkness absorbed him. Then he locked the gate, replaced the tin cup on its shelf, and stood for a moment at the pump, looking at his hands in the lantern light. He was glad he had given the man the water. He knew that was the right thing. He was also aware that he had touched the cup, and that the cup had touched Ladder's lips, and that Ladder was sick. He pumped more water over his hands and scrubbed them with the small brush that lived beside the pump, working carefully between his fingers, and told himself that this was sufficient, knowing it probably was not. The hours between 2 and 4 in the morning were the heaviest. He had known this for 11 years, had known it so thoroughly that it had become a fixed feature of the night, as reliable as the fact of darkness itself. In those hours, the city, which had been merely quiet since dusk, became something more than quiet. It became absent. It was as if during those hours the city briefly stopped believing in itself and let the other thing come in, the thing that lived under streets and behind walls and at the bottom of rivers, the thing that was simply the world before men had put their lamps and their noise into it. In those hours, the warehouse felt very large and very old, and his lantern felt very small, and the sound of his own footsteps on the brick floor was the loudest sound in the world. He did not mind it, usually. The weight of those hours was familiar to him, and he had learned to carry it the way you carry a known weight, not without effort, but without surprise. He walked his circuits and thought his thoughts and drank from the tin cup and waited for the hours to pass, which they always did. Tonight the hours were heavier than usual. He thought about Ladder moving through the dark streets. He thought about Marie Colbert, dead of fever in her house on Annunciation Street, and the boy Thomas, who might be somewhere in the city, or might have been taken somewhere else, or might. This thought he did not dwell on, but could not entirely prevent, might be in neither category. He thought about the dead rats along the warehouse walls. He thought about the 22 strokes of the bell. He thought about his hands, which he had scrubbed at the pump, and which still felt, in some way he could not entirely rationalize, unclean. At 3:30, he heard something outside the gate. He came out of the warehouse into the loading yard and stood listening. For a moment there was nothing, and he thought he had imagined it. The heat and the late hour could do things to a man's perception. He knew this, and then he heard it again. Not a rattling of the bars, not a voice, but a sound lower than either of those things. A sound like something settling against something. He took his lantern and walked to the gate. Ladder was there. He had not gone far, perhaps half a block, perhaps a block. He was lying on the cobblestones about 15 feet from the gate, on his side, with his coat pulled around him in the way a man pulls a coat around him when he is trying to make a bed of the ground. His eyes were open, and when Elias raised the lantern, he could see the fever glitter in them, brighter now than it had been an hour ago, which was not a good sign. "I couldn't keep walking," Ladder said. His voice was lower and rougher than before. Elias stood at the gate with his lantern and looked at him. Ladder on the cobblestones, the empty street stretching away in both directions, the locked gate between them. He was aware of everything about this moment with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. The warmth of the lantern handle in his palm, the roughness of the iron gate bars under his other hand, the sound of the river, the distance between himself and the man lying on the ground. He did not open the gate. He stood at the bars and looked at Ladder and did not open the gate. And he was aware that he was not opening it, and aware of why he was not opening it. And he did not open it. The fever killed most people. It took within 3 to 7 days. He had read this in the newspaper's medical column, which had been publishing information about yellow fever with the dedicated urgency of a paper that understood its readership, was frightened, and needed to be told things, even things that were not entirely comforting. The first stage was the fever and the sweating. The second stage sometimes involved a brief, deceptive improvement, a return of energy and appetite that made a person think the worst was over. The third stage, the black stage, the newspapers called it carefully, without entirely explaining what the name referred to, was when people died. He looked at Ladder's eyes. He looked at the brightness in them and the waxy quality of the skin around them and the shallow, rapid work of his breathing. He tried to make an assessment of which stage this was, and found that he could not make it with any confidence. What he could assess with confidence was this: if he opened the gate and went out there and touched the man, touched his face to test the fever, or lifted his head, or moved him in any way, he would be very close to a man who was deeply ill with yellow fever, and he had already touched the cup that Ladder's lips had touched, and every additional point of contact between them increased a risk that he had been living with for 3 weeks and managing. So far, only by maintaining his distance from anyone who showed signs of illness. He was 57 years old with a bad knee and a missing ear, and no family and nowhere particular to go. He was the night watchman for 3,000 bales of cotton that no ship would come to collect while the city was quarantined. He had no one who depended on him. He stood at the gate and did not open it. The shame was immediate and specific, not a vague or general shame, but the precise, localized shame of a man who has just watched himself do something he does not respect, and who cannot pretend he did not watch it. He had stood at the gate and looked at a sick man on the ground and had not opened the gate, and his reason for not opening it had been entirely self-interested, and he knew this. He had dressed it in the language of assessment and probability, fever stages and contact risk, and the management of danger over time. But underneath that language, there was simply fear, and he knew that too. He had been afraid of many things over the course of 57 years. He had been afraid in the war, genuinely, physically terrified, in the way that only a man under fire who understands that the fire is real and has no abstract component can be afraid. He had been afraid when Cora died, afraid of the specific shape of the future without her. He had been afraid, at various smaller moments, in the ways that ordinary life required. Afraid of failure, afraid of poverty, afraid of the accumulated loneliness of a life spent largely alone. He had managed each of these fears in various ways, some better than others. He had not always acted well. He knew that. But he had not, since the war, stood at a gate and looked at a man who needed help and simply refused to move. He stood at the gate and thought about this. He thought about the schoolroom in Knoxville where he had picked up his hat and walked out. He thought about Henri Beaumont, who had a wife and 3 daughters, shaking his hand and leaving the city. He thought about James Ladder walking down the dark street on legs that had already decided, even if Ladder himself had not known it yet, that they could not carry him much farther, he thought. You are 57 years old, and you have been careful all your life, and careful has brought you to this gate in this city with this man on the ground outside it. The sky to the east was changing. It was still dark, but the quality of the darkness was shifting, moving from the true black of the deepest hours toward something slightly less absolute. A dark blue at the horizon that suggested the sun was working toward it from the other side of the world, making its slow, obligatory approach. He had seen this transition 10,000 times in his 11 years on this shift, and he still noticed it every night, still felt the slight easing of something in his chest when the darkness began to loosen its hold. Dawn was perhaps an hour away. He stood at the gate with his lantern and looked at Ladder on the cobblestones and tried to decide what kind of man he was, not what kind of man he had been across 57 years. That record was complex and mixed and full of the ambiguities that all long records contain. But what kind of man he was right now, in this specific moment, with this specific choice in front of him. He thought of something Cora had said to him once, years before she died, in a conversation about a man in their town who had refused to help a neighbor during a hard winter, and then had spent years afterward explaining to anyone who would listen why the refusal had been reasonable. The explaining, she had said, with the clear-eyed judgment that was her particular gift, is always worse than the original decision. If you have to spend years explaining it, you probably already know what the right thing was. He had remembered this across all the years since. He thought about it now. He had no one to explain himself to. He had no one who would ask. He would carry whatever he did here, and whatever he did not do here, alone. He opened the gate. He did it without allowing himself more deliberation, deliberately cutting off the deliberation, the way you cut a line to keep from being pulled overboard. He swung the gate open and walked out onto the cobblestones, crouching beside Ladder with his lantern held low. Ladder was conscious, barely. His eyes tracked the lantern light. His breathing was fast and shallow, a breathing that was working harder than it should have had to for the amount of air it was moving. "I'm going to sit you up," Elias said. He slid one hand behind Ladder's shoulders and lifted. Ladder was heavier than he looked, dead weight in the way that people become when their body is using all its resources elsewhere and has none left for the voluntary management of itself. Elias got him into a sitting position against the fence post and crouched in front of him, studying his face. The fever was high. That much was plain. The skin under Elias' hand had been very warm. The yellow tinge he had feared was not yet in Ladder's eyes, which perhaps meant something, or perhaps meant nothing at all. "Can you walk?" he asked. Ladder looked at him. "Maybe a little," he said. "If you," he did not finish the sentence. "I'm going to bring you inside," Elias said. "Into the yard. There's a cot in the gatehouse. It's not much." "You don't have to, I know," Elias said. "Get your arm up." He got Ladder as far as the gatehouse. It took the better part of 20 minutes. Ladder could walk, barely. If Elias took most of his weight on the side where Elias' good arm was, and if they moved very slowly and stopped frequently. The gatehouse was a small wooden structure just inside the main gate, barely large enough for a cot, a chair, and a small table, which was where the watchman's logbook lived. It smelled of oil and wood, and the pipe tobacco that Henri Beaumont had smoked during his shifts, a smell that Elias had never bothered to clear out, because it was simply part of the air of the place. He got Ladder onto the cot and covered him with the wool blanket that lived folded at the cot's foot. He brought water in the tin cup and held it for Ladder to drink, though Ladder could not drink much. He put the lantern on the table and sat in the chair and looked at the man on the cot. He stayed there for the remainder of the night. He did not sleep. He kept his circuits reduced to short loops around the gatehouse, close enough to hear if Ladder's condition changed. Once, at around 5 in the morning, Ladder began talking in his sleep, or in his fever, which was not quite sleeping, and Elias sat very still and listened to him. He was talking to his sister. He was saying her name repeatedly, Marie, Marie, in the particular tone of someone who is trying to get the attention of someone who is not responding, and who is beginning to understand that the reason they are not responding is not that they are too far away, but that they are not there. Elias sat with his hands on his knees and listened to this and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. At some point before dawn, Ladder went quiet. The sun came up over the river at 20 minutes past 6. Elias was in the loading yard, sitting on a cotton bale when it came. The sky lightened from the east, and the river caught the early light. And for a few minutes, everything on the waterfront was the color of old bronze, the levee, the water, the warehouse bricks, the cotton bales under their overhang. He sat and watched it, and felt the warmth of it on the ruined left side of his face where his ear should have been. Ladder was dead. He had died sometime between 5 and 6 in the morning. Elias had checked on him at 5 and found him feverish and breathing. When he had checked again at 20 past 6, after the sun had come up, the breathing had stopped. He had stood in the door of the gatehouse for a long moment looking at the man on the cot, at the stillness of him, at the way the stillness was different from sleep. Then he had pulled the blanket up and stepped back outside and closed the gatehouse door. He had done what he could. He knew this, and he also knew that doing what you can and doing enough are not always the same thing, and that knowing the difference between the two does not make the difference easier to hold. He had not opened the gate when he should have. He had opened it eventually. In the final reckoning, if there was a final reckoning, which he was not certain he believed, he hoped that the first fact and the second fact might be weighed together rather than separately. He thought about James Ladder and the boy Thomas, somewhere in the city or somewhere outside it, and about Marie Colbert in her house on Annunciation Street, and about the 22 strokes of the bell the night before, and about all the other bells and all the other strokes he had not heard and could not count. He thought, the river keeps moving. At 7 o'clock, the warehouse crew did not come. He waited in the loading yard until 7:30, and then until 8, and they did not come. He was not surprised. The epidemic had been in this district for 2 weeks now, and the crew, 12 men, most of them Irish immigrants living in the riverfront neighborhoods, had been thinning out over the past week as men made arrangements for their families and left, or fell sick, or simply did not come back. There had been 4 men 2 days ago. Today there were none. He went back inside the gatehouse, opened the logbook on the small table, and wrote in his careful, slightly old-fashioned hand the entry for the night. Date, time on shift, time off shift, conditions, incidents. Under incidents, he wrote, 1 man taken ill outside the gate, brought inside, died before morning. Name, James Ladder, St. Genevieve, Missouri. Will notify the city collector. Under conditions, he wrote, quiet, cotton bales undisturbed, building secure. He blotted the ink and closed the book. He sat in the chair for a while after that, in the small gatehouse with the logbook closed and Ladder still on the cot with the blanket pulled up over his face, and he listened to the sounds of the morning. The river, a bird somewhere on the levee calling, the faint, distant sound of a cart moving through a street 3 or 4 blocks away. The city was still there, diminished, frightened, bleeding from a wound it had not finished bleeding from. But there, the light was coming through the small gatehouse window and laying itself across the floor in a long, pale rectangle, and Elias sat in it and let it warm his hands, which were old and scarred and missing nothing except what had always been missing, and would be there at the gate again tonight, same as every night, same as he had always been. He was the night watchman. It was morning. He stayed. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.